This week's episode of Naked Mormonism is brought to you by $49sites.com. Visit $49sites and enter promo code NAKED to get a free upgrade to the Pro
Man who grew up in the church, served as a full-time missionary, and married a lovely woman, was surprised when some of his siblings began speaking critically of the church and the prophet Joseph Smith. After a time, they left the church and tried to persuade him to follow. As often happens in such cases, they bombarded him with essays, podcasts, and videos produced by critics, most of whom were themselves disaffected former members of the church. His siblings mocked his faith, telling him that he was gullible and misled. He didn't have answers for all their assertions, and his faith began to waver under the relentless opposition. He wondered if he should stop attending church. He talked with his wife. He talked with people he trusted. He prayed. As he meditated in this troubled state of mind, he recalled occasions when he had felt the Holy Spirit and had received a witness of the truth by the Spirit. He concluded, if I'm honest with myself, I must admit that the Spirit has touched me more than once, and the testimony of the Spirit is real. He has a renewed sense of happiness and peace that is shared by his wife and children.
I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. Welcome back, everybody. We are finally picking up right where we left off in our historical timeline with Joe and friends in Nauvoo of August 1842. We've been absent our historical timeline for a number of weeks now, so it feels like there's a little bit of a review in order here. If you're listening to this in the backlog and the timeline is contiguous for you, my apologies, of course, but for everyone else, hopefully this will help bridge this month-long gap. Our timeline sits amidst the ruins of the Bennett Meltdown. John C. Reckitt Bennett had spent a year and a half as the right-hand man of Joseph Smith collecting a ton of information. Now, beginning in July of 1842, he published his first expose letters in the Sangamo Journal. These letters contained vicious accusations of Joe's true polygamous theocracy. Now, Joe's theocracy without the veil of prosperity being touted about by the leadership, it looked like a completely different beast. Medusa removing her mask, if you will. Add into the PR nightmare that was Reckitt Bennett's exposés, ex-governor and current senatorial candidate Lilburn Boggs of Missouri had recently awakened from the assassination attempt and swore out an affidavit leading to the arrest of Joe and his best friend, pistol-packing Porter Rockwell. When we left off, they were both in custody of the Adams County constables with an extradition order in the works to take them to Missouri. What awaited them in Missouri? Well, the charges of conspiracy to assassinate a government official on one hand, and on the other hand, the old charges from the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri of arson, robbery, and high treason. So as soon as Joe and Port made it across the state line into Missouri in the custody of government officials, they were doomed to the gallows or a firing squad. There's no question or ambiguity about that. They just needed to remain under the safe umbrella of Nauvoo, and they could survive in the Mormon kingdom on the Mississippi. However, they had limited time and options to effect a plan. Luckily, a few convenient pieces of Nauvoo government were in place in order to set the battlefield in their favor. So before we continue marching forward, I kind of want to take a second to set the scene for what we can expect today. And I'm going to do that by reflecting on how fickle power really is. This concept of power, how easy it is to gain and lose power, and what predicaments are created when single individuals vie for power in a world of people competing for finite slices of the power pie. To put this in a little more context, I was thinking back on this year's Sunstone in Salt Lake City and a presentation given by Steve Shields. He gave an overview of the succession crisis after Joe's death, and he quoted a number of letters which talked about authority. Who has the authority to excommunicate whom in the wake of Joe's death? Who was the one true prophet? Well, those two concepts, power and authority, they're inextricably tied. But when it all comes down to it, people only have authority if other people recognize and acknowledge said authority. Same thing with power. The most powerful politician in the world has just as much authority as a person screaming on the street corner. The politician just has more people who recognize and acknowledge that authority. The politician has more power than the screaming person on the street corner because they've personally seized or have been granted that power by outside forces. But all of this, it's all entirely human concept, like language, emotions, buildings, they're all human constructs, right? The universe doesn't care what we call a rock. A rock is just certain matter arranged in a certain way. The universe doesn't care who sits on a throne or who begs for food. Power and authority and the resulting human luxuries both afford are just things that we all agree collectively as a society to put value in. Joseph Smith in 1842 had fostered a situation where he had more authority and power than basically any American religious leader of his day. Now, some can say that he was granted that authority from a higher power, but we've spent this entire podcast exhibiting exactly the methods by which he was able to seize and retain control. By 1842, he had roughly 10,000 people calling him the prophet, claiming to be the mouthpiece of God, but those claims mean nothing if nobody is listening to what comes out of the claimant's mouth. But Joe had an audience, a pulpit that he could approach every Sunday with thousands of people in the audience fawning over his every word. He had a ton of power and authority in the minds of these people. Now, a shared trait among most with power and authority is the lack of willingness to cede such attributes at any cost. When a person gains power, seldom do they relinquish it willingly, especially in positions without term limits, like prophet of a major religion. Anything threatening Smith's power structure required treatment with the utmost prejudice and expediency. Joseph Smith and his enforcer, Pistol Packin' Porter Rockwell, in cuffs, headed toward Missouri, certainly threatened the tenuous power balance that Joe had manufactured, over a decade by this point. They had to be released at all costs. Where we last left off our historical timeline, it was in the History of the Church, the Dan Vogel edition, Volume 5, page 80. Quote, "This forenoon I was arrested by the Deputy Sheriff of Adams County and 2 assistants on a warrant issued by Governor Carlin, founded on a requisition from Governor Reynolds of Missouri, upon the affidavit of ex-Governor Boggs complaining of the said Smith as being an accessory before the fact to an assault with intent to kill, made by one O.P. Rockwell on Lilburn W. Boggs, on the night of the 6th of May, A.D. 1842. Brother Rockwell was arrested at the same time as principal. There was no evasion of the officers, though the municipal court issued a writ of habeas corpus according to the Constitution of the state, Article 8 and Section 13. This writ demanded the bodies of Messrs. Smith and Rockwell to be brought before the aforesaid court, but these officers refused to do so, and finally, without complying, they left them in the care of the marshal, without the original writ by which they were arrested, and by which only they could be retained, and returned back to Governor Carlin for further instructions, and Messrs. Smith and Rockwell went about their business." End quote. So what that means is the Adams County constables had the warrant for arrest for Joe and Port, but in order to extradite the prisoners to Missouri, where they were going to go, they were required to go back to Governor Carlin in Adams County, in Quincy, and acquire that writ. So the constables, and I can't possibly wrap my mind around this, what led them to believe that this was a good idea, they left Joe and Port in the hands of the Nauvoo Marshal, Henry G. Sherwood, at this time. Now, Sherwood, he'd been a member since he was baptized 10 years earlier and moved to Kirtland. Sherwood was an OG Kirtland Mormon who'd been through all of the hardest times of the church in K-Town and Missouri. He'd always stuck by the prophet's side, and these Adams County constables in charge of extraditing Joe and Port, they left them in the custody of Sherwood. "Sure, Constable, I'll keep an eye on them." Oh, no, they got away. I'm just all thumbs today, aren't I? It's amazing. I mean, in response to the Adams County constables getting so close to legally extraditing Joe and Port to Missouri, action was needed to keep it from happening again. So acting as vice mayor and president pro tempore, Hiram Sidekick Abiff Smith passed an ordinance effective immediately. Quote, Section 1. Be it ordained by the City Council of the City of Nauvoo that in all cases where any person or persons shall at any time hereafter be arrested or under arrest in this city, under any writ or process, and shall be brought before the municipal court of this city by virtue of a writ of habeas corpus, the court shall in every such case have power and authority, and are hereby required to examine into the origin, validity, and legality of the writ of process, under which such arrest was made. And if it shall appear to the court upon sufficient testimony that said writ or process was illegal or not legally issued, or did not proceed from proper authority and was a legal process, the court shall then proceed and fully hear the merits of the case, upon which said arrest was made, upon such evidence as may be produced and sworn before said court. I'm going to summarize this at the end. Just give me a second. And shall have power to adjourn the hearing and also issue process from time to time in their discretion in order to procure the attendance of witnesses, so that a fair and impartial trial and decision may be obtained in every such case. Okay, what did that just say? Basically, that Section 1 created a situation where any person arrested in Nauvoo, or even under arrest, having been arrested somewhere else but passing through Nauvoo under any authority whatsoever, the warrant for their arrest had to undergo review by the Nauvoo government in order to ascertain its legality before it could be carried out, before the people could be removed from the city of Nauvoo. So the original article in the Nauvoo City Charter allowing the city to issue writs of habeas corpus to any person in custody now had built in an extra layer of protection. Now, the other provisions in this ordinance add even more layers, playing into this religious persecution narrative of Mormonism. Section 2. And be it further ordained that if upon investigation it shall be proven before the municipal court that the writ or process of arrest has been issued either through private pique, malicious intent, or religious or other persecution, falsehood or misrepresentation, contrary to the Constitution of this state or the Constitution of the United States, the said writ or process shall be quashed and considered of no force or effect, and the prisoner or prisoners shall be released and discharged therefrom. That was the teeth of the ordinance. If any writ or process can be deemed as religious persecution, malicious intent, or based on falsehoods, of course, religious persecution, that's a pretty broad net, that writ or process is quashed, and the arrested parties are immediately released. Luckily, Joe and the leadership of Nauvoo were the people who determined what did or did not constitute maliciousness, falsehood, or religious persecution, of course. Now, the last two sections of the ordinance just say that if the mayor can't represent himself in these proceedings, like if he is hiding out from the law, then an alderman can actually step in, and also that it is effective immediately. So, after Joe was released and the constables were headed to Quincy in order to speak with Governor Carlin and get a writ of extradition to the state of Missouri, Joe spent a bit of time pondering in his journal what authority the constable had to extradite him from Illinois to Missouri. Quote, I have yet to learn by what rule of right I was arrested to be transported to Missouri for a trial of the kind stated. An accessory to an assault with the intent to kill does not come under the provision of the Fugitive Act when the person charged has not been out of Illinois. An accessory before the fact to manslaughter is something of an anomaly. The isolated affidavit of ex-Governor Boggs is no more than any other man's, and the Constitution says that no person shall be liable to be transported out of the state for an offense committed within the same. The whole is another Missouri farce. It's fake news. In fact, implied power and constructive guilt as a discernier resort may answer the purpose of despotic governments, but are beneath the dignity of the Sons of Liberty, and would be a blot on our judicial escutcheon. End quote. If anything, Joe's actions and the resulting Nauvoo City Ordinance illustrate just how necessary federal charges and a federal police state force really is. I mean, he hadn't committed the act of conspiracy with Port while in the state of Missouri. Joe was in Nauvoo the whole time. He never set foot back in Missouri. It wasn't accessory to manslaughter, as Boggs' assassination attempt was clearly premeditated with a clear and distinct motive, but because Joe wasn't physically in Missouri when it happened, he was safe unless a writ of extradition was upheld by Governor Carlin. If Carlin expected the Mormon vote for that election year of 1842, issuing and upholding that writ would definitely turn the largest population of his constituents against him. But the kingpin to a criminal empire lived in Hancock County, to which Governor Carlin was responsible for keeping the peace and rooting out corruption. Carlin was not in an easy position, and Joe was growing stronger by the day. Nauvoo city government had a ton of power. Now that this ordinance was in place, it would require the state Supreme Court to rule it unconstitutional, but that could only happen after the ordinance was exercised and somebody filed a lawsuit challenging it. That's the entire point. Nauvoo government could do whatever it wanted, and it took a lengthy and costly process in order to curtail that power. Power is gained and seldom given back freely once acquired. However, Joe knew that once the constable returned to Nauvoo after meeting with Governor Carlin, that the constable would have the proper paperwork. Pistol-packing Porter, he was out. He immediately fled towards Pittsburgh, which is understandable. Port pulled the trigger. He was a lot hotter than Joe at this time. But on the other hand, Joe leveraged Nauvoo's convenient location on the Mississippi, and he hopped across the river. He made it across to the town of Zarahemla in Iowa Territory. Nobody with authority from Missouri or Illinois could touch Joe out there. Joe made it to a safe location, his Uncle John's house. Once again, interstate police forces exist for a reason. Nauvoo became a hostile place with Joe in hiding and Port on the run. The constable, a sheriff of Adams County, returned to Nauvoo with the appropriate extradition paperwork, only to find that the prisoners he had left in the custody of Henry Sherwood just happened to not be there anymore. But the sheriff had a legal duty to carry out the charges of his office to the best of his ability. So he went to the Smith home in Nauvoo, where Emma and her children were, and a hot exchange ensued. Unfortunately, we don't have exact record of what happened there, but what we do have is what is recorded in the history of the church. Quote, Wednesday, August 10th, the deputy sheriff returned to Nauvoo, but I was absent. Absent. And he did not see me or Brother Rockwell. He endeavored to alarm my wife and the brethren with his threats if I was not forthcoming, but they understood the law in such cases, and his threats proved harmless. End quote. They understood the law in such cases. One could make the argument that they perfectly understood the law as it was crafted by the Nauvoo government, because they were all involved, and they used that law in order to allow two fugitives to escape. Yes, they knew the law, but they also knew that the laws of God were superior to the laws of men. So on one hand, we have them creating a theocracy where they can do whatever they want, but on the other hand, well, the laws of men wanted to see Joe hanged, and the laws of God required him to lead Mormons to build Zion on the American continent. What set of laws would we expect the Mormons to follow? That's a question we should ask ourselves every day. Continuing on, 11th of August. This forenoon, Brother William Law entered into conversation with the sheriff upon the illegality of the whole proceedings in reference to the arrest, when after some remarks from both parties, the sheriff acknowledged that he believed Joseph was innocent, and that Governor Carlin's course which he had pursued was unjustifiable and illegal. End quote. What actually transpired in that exchange is completely unknown. I can't imagine a complete polar opposite shift in the mind of this sheriff from just one day prior, right? So he had just lost both of his high-level prisoners. Then he went and threatened Emma and other Mormon elites in order to get them to give up Joe and Port, all to no avail. He was taking his job seriously, and what stern talking to awaited him when he returned back to Governor Carlin with a report that Joe and Porter had escaped custody. I mean, what would Governor Reynolds of Missouri have to say to the sheriff when he finds out that Joe and Port evaded the law once again? I mean, this sheriff's job was likely on the line here, yet William Law talked to him for a few minutes and everything was cool? mean, it seems a little hard to believe. But now that Joe was safe on the lam for a minute, he needed to call together a council of his trusted elites in order to sort out what would be their next best action to take. Because if he was in Montrose, that was just across the river, it's perfectly expected he might be hiding out there. Once again, quote from the history of the church. I sent word that I wished to see Emma, brothers Hiram Smith, William Law, and others, with instructions to meet me on the island between Nauvoo and Montrose. After dark, Emma, Hiram, William Law, Newell K. Whitney, George Miller, William Clayton, and Dimmick B. Huntington met at the waterside near the brick store and proceeded in a skiff between the islands until they arrived near the lower end, and then hailed to shore. After waiting a very little while, the skiff arrived from the opposite shore, and in it were myself and brother Erastus H. Derby. A council was then held in the skiffs, and various statements set forth in regard to the state of things. It was reported that the governor of Iowa had issued a warrant for my apprehension and that of O.P. Rockwell, and that the sheriff of Lee County was expected down immediately. Very strong evidence also manifested that Governor Reynolds of Missouri was not acquainted with these proceedings. So everything was happening, but Governor Reynolds was, a few hundred miles south near St. Louis in Missouri. He didn't know what was going on, that Joe had escaped. That ex-Governor Boggs had made an oath before a justice of the peace or a judge, and that the judge had made the requisition and not Governor Reynolds. Also that the writ issued by Carlin was illegal and unjustifiable. Now, what that was claiming is that Governor Reynolds of Missouri had no idea of the extradition warrant in the first place, that it was just Governor Boggs who went to a local justice of the peace and swore out the affidavit. But that's not really what the historical record says. It is absolutely certain that the whole business is another glaring instance to the effects of prejudice against me as a religious teacher, and that it proceeds from a persecuting spirit. The parties having signified their determination to have me taken to Missouri, whether by legal or illegal means, it was finally concluded that I should be taken up the river in a skiff and landed below Ebenezer Wiggins' farm, so called, and that I should proceed from thence to Brother Edward Sayers, and there abide for a season. End quote. That's what they decided to do. After they claimed or figured out that nowhere in Montrose or Nauvoo was safe for Joe, they needed to get him out of town in safe hiding for as long as possible. So Wiggins' farm was a good disembarking point to hold up for a minute before proceeding on to Sayers' house. But how could they do this without attracting the attention of the sheriff in town? I mean, they were meeting under the cover of night. If the sheriff saw anything out of the ordinary, he'd instantly begin tailing anybody who might lead him to Joe or Port. So, a little plan was devised. Joe decided to send Albert P. Rockwood. That's not O.P. Rockwell, that's A.P. Rockwood. They get mixed up in newspaper headlines. I've seen it happen a number of times. So, Joe sent Rockwood up the river on the Nauvoo side to find Wiggins' farm. And this is all happening in the middle of the night. This is one night where this meeting occurred and where they decided what to do. Now, Jonathan Dunham rode Joe and Erastus Derby up the river north of Nauvoo. Now, Rockwood's task was to find Wiggins' farm, come to the bank of the Mississippi, and light 2 fires as a signal for them to disembark. The plan was carried out that same night, but it wasn't without its hiccups. They first came to a place on the river where a fire was lit, thinking that was Rockwood's fire. They were mistaken, but luckily the person was friendly and let them pass along without signaling that he had found the fugitives, after they swore him to secrecy. Joe, Derby, and Dunham continued up the river until they found the 2 fires by Rockwood, and there Joe found very brief refuge on Wiggins' farm and then made his way to Edward Sayers' home. So this holdup was pretty nice for a minute, but Joe still had a city to run, okay, and thus required meetings with trusted elites in order to put his desires into effect. The most important item on the agenda, get a recognized authority to declare that arrest and extradition warrants for Joe were illegal. Nauvoo had just passed that ordinance, less than half a week prior that we read earlier by, Hiram sidekick Abiff Smith. And that granted a lot of authority for Nauvoo government to declare specific writs and warrants illegal. But if those continued to be enforced by governors of Iowa, Illinois, and Missouri, Nauvoo's authority didn't count for much when pitted against governors of states and a territory. So, To recap this all, Joe was wanted in 2 states and a territory at this time. And there were still a number of people in Kirtland, Ohio, who had outstanding subpoenas to bring Joe in to court for debts that he owed them. Basically, everywhere Joe had been for the last decade wanted him behind bars or facing the gallows. But never forget, it was all religious persecution, right? The sheriff, still in Nauvoo, thought that Joe was hiding out there, not miles up the river like he really was. So Joe and friends devised a little plan in order to lead him to believe that he was no longer in Nauvoo and definitely wasn't still in the state of Illinois. So a man named William Walker, in conspicuous sight of numerous people in Nauvoo and the sheriff, who was still trying to find Joe at this time, left Joe's house on Joe's horse and crossed the river towards Montrose, towards Iowa. Now, they hoped this would be a clever little diversion. What was it a diversion for? Well, Emma and William Law decided to send 2 messengers to Burlington, Iowa, where Governor John Chambers, that's the governor of Iowa, resided. And what they were doing was trying to find out whether or not he had issued a warrant for the arrest of Joe and Port in the territory of Iowa. Because if he hadn't, then it would be safe to hide out there because they were wanted in Illinois and Missouri. So this diversion allowed those 2 messengers to depart without being noticed, and it also allowed William Clayton and John D. Parker to slip out of Nauvoo northwards to make their way to Sayers to meet with Joe in hiding. So, yeah, William Walker looking like Joe on Joe's horse crossing the river, it caught people off guard. Now, the sheriff at some point must have realized that this was all a ruse. He remained in Nauvoo, not crossing the river to attempt finding Joe in Montrose because Joe wasn't there to be found, and he must have figured it out at some point. Instead, this sheriff decided on the next best conclusion, to tail Emma. Maybe in a day, maybe in a week, he knew that Emma would leave Nauvoo to go visit her husband in hiding, and she would lead him right to Joe. Now, the thing is, Emma had been here before, though. Her husband had been wanted by a lot of people many times throughout their marriage. She was smart enough to know that she'd be trailed when she went to meet with Joe the next day. Now, Joe was rightfully scared throughout all of this. His journal reads in a way that's, it just sounds like there's just boiling tension constantly hanging as like a cloud over his head. The letter to which he's referring is no longer extant in this passage, so we don't know the contents, but what Joe reported of the contents is quite fascinating. Of course, to preface this, he made it seem like Governor Carlin was on his side in the whole matter, but that was not evidently the case, as later events will attest. Regardless, what the letter did reveal, apparently, was that the Missouri officials were nowhere near done chasing Joe. Quote, "This forenoon, Brother Hiram received a letter from Elder Hollister at Quincy, stating that Governor Carlin had said that his proceedings were illegal and that he should not pursue the subject any further. The letter also stated that Edward R. Ford," now Ford was the agent who was going to take Joe off of the hands of the sheriff and take him at the state line between Illinois and Iowa. Ford was the guy, the Missouri constable, who was going to take custody of Joe and Port and remove them down to Richmond. So Edward R. Ford had concluded to take the first boat and start home, and then he was going to fetch a force from Missouri. All this, my friends thought, was only a scheme got up for the purpose of throwing us off our guard, that they might come unexpectedly, kidnap, and carry me to Missouri." End quote. So this Agent Ford, he was ready to serve the necessary papers to Joe and get him in custody and bring him back to Missouri. This guy was done messing around and was headed back to Missouri to bring a small armed force to Nauvoo in order to effect the arrest. Throughout all of this, Joe needed to see Emma. Okay, but the sheriff was trailing her. So she decided to take the carriage, but the sheriff noticed immediately and began trailing her. But, once again, this wasn't the first time that this had happened, and Emma was smart. So instead of heading north out of town straight towards Sayers' house where Joe was hiding, she instead took a little detour to wait out the sheriff. So she went to Elizabeth Durfee's house and waited there for probably, a couple hours, who knows. But she had a plan all along to throw the sheriff off of her trail. Once at Elizabeth's house, she had William Clayton with another carriage that had drawn curtains pass along the river near Elizabeth's house, while Emma's carriage remained parked in front of Elizabeth's house, and, the sheriff was waiting somewhere nearby watching it. Emma snuck out the other side and got in the carriage brought around by William Clayton. So with this little scheme, she was able to head north out of Nauvoo as the evening turned to night, completely undetected. The old shell game. They took the back roads out of Nauvoo. They arrived at the field of Wigham's farm, and then Emma got out of the carriage and walked the rest of the way to Sayer's house, where Joe was in hiding. That night, while they remained together, some uncomfortable intelligence also came to Emma and Joe's attention. Quote, "A report came over the river that there are several small companies of men in Montrose, Nashville, Keokuk, etc., in search of Joseph. They saw his horse go down the river yesterday and were confident he was on that side. They swear they will have him." End quote. With the assurance that her husband would be all right and was sufficiently well hidden, Emma made her way back to Nauvoo, undetected. The next few days were tense. That little ruse with William Walker disguised as Joe on Joe's horse crossing the river, that threw some people off of his trail, but what that did mean was that they wouldn't find him in Montrose and they would keep searching. A bounty of $1,300 was placed on Joseph's head, which essentially deputized anybody who wanted to be a bounty hunter to bring him into the custody of the sheriff of Adams County, which, of course, would lead to his transfer to Agent Ford and his extradition to Missouri. Of course, Port was on the chopping block throughout all of this as well, but he was long gone by this time. Besides, if you can disarm the Mormon Colossus or just take its head off completely, which option do you think Governor Reynolds would go for? I mean, getting Pistol Pack and Port in custody was a priority. Getting Joe in Missouri State custody was a necessity. Joe knew the law was closing in on him, and it was only a matter of time before he fell into custody that he wouldn't be able to escape from. He was pushing 4 out of 5 wanted stars here. He had to lie low while somebody was, keeping watch on the church and keeping everything running. And, he had to somehow keep his followers from caving to the public pressure that was being caused by the Bennett Meltdown. How could he retain control? And further, with all the new revelations made public by Bennett, who could he still trust? Now, I have to say, whenever Joe is chained down to one location away from his regular daily responsibilities, those are some of my favorite times in Mormon history. When Joe couldn't leave the confines of a building for whatever reason, that's when he wrote. That's when we get a view into the mind of Joseph Smith, where otherwise we wouldn't have access to it. Most writings concerning Joseph Smith don't come from him, but from people close to him and his various secretaries and scribes. Joseph's own writings in his own hand are surprisingly few when compared to the mountain of documentation from other people that were near him. However, while he was in hiding from the law here in August of 1842, he exchanged a number of letters with Mormon elites, including Emma. Let's spend some time on those exchanges as they provide a window into the chaos of August 1842. But before we do, we need to hear a word from our sponsor this week, $49 Sites. Hey everybody, you may have heard me talk about $49 Sites before. What is $49sites.com? Well, Bryce, I'm glad you asked. $49 Sites is a website of web developers who will create any kind of website that you might need. Now, whether that website is for pleasure or a hobby or you need something for your own business, $49 Sites is where you need to go. Now, I spent the first 3 years of this podcast doing my own website. I don't have any training in web development aside from a single semester class in high school, and the old website showed just how adept I really wasn't. So I signed up with $49 Sites, and I had a team member assigned to me to make an awesome website. Now, if you go to nakedmormonismpodcast.com, you can see what it looks like when pros are put in control of all of the little stuff. They do hosting and daily backups, so all of my information is always safe, even if my computer here at Ground Gnome Studios goes down. They custom design everything according to my every neurotic whim, and most importantly, they SEO'd my site. Now anytime somebody searches my name or the podcast, it's guaranteed that my site comes up long before any Mormon apologist website who supposedly debunked the podcast. Here are a few other features that come along with the basic subscription to $49 sites. Unlimited updates, a contact form, stock images that come included as part of the subscription, a sleek design created by people who are actually professional web development experts, and most important of all, a website designed specifically to be optimized for mobile. If your site doesn't work on a phone, that's a lot of lost traffic. $49 sites takes care of that and so much more. But listeners of this show, when you sign up with promo code NAKED at checkout, you get a free upgrade to the Pro package. Now, what do you get with the Pro package? You get Google Analytics, an entire photo gallery set with photo sliders, promotional pop-ups, which can be great for advertising, Google Maps integration, text animation, and an entire suite of extra goodies to make your website really awesome. Just don't forget the promo code NAKED when you check out to get that free upgrade. So if you have a small business or you run a podcast or have any other need for a website, go to $49sites.com and enter promo code NAKED. Once again, $49sites.com, promo code NAKED. Try it and you'll regret not signing up sooner. And now, back to the show. Joe was in hiding. He had to keep everything in check from afar. Here's the first letter that he wrote to his acting second-in-command of the Nauvoo Legion, Wilson Law. Now, Wilson Law had just been elected Major General with the upset in leadership since the Bennett Meltdown. It's a small window into the mind of Joseph Smith at this time, when he realistically thought that he would be captured and executed. Now, this letter reads more like the last will and testament of a martyr than that of a letter of direction. But there's also a bit of a theocratic tinge to this as well. I'm going to leave a link to all of these letters on the Joseph Smith papers in the show notes. Major General Law. Dear General, I take this opportunity to give you some instructions how I wish you to act in case our persecutors should carry their pursuits so far as to tread upon our rights as free-born American citizens. The orders which I am about to give you is the result of a long series of contemplation since I saw you. I've come fully to the conclusion, both since this last difficulty commenced as before, that I never would suffer myself to go into the hands of the Missourians alive. And to go into the hands of the officers of this state is nothing more or less than to go into the hands of the Missourians. For the whole farce has been gotten up, unlawfully and unconstitutionally, as well on the part of governors and others, by a mob spirit, for the purpose of carrying out mob violence, to carry on mob tolerance in a religious persecution. I am determined, therefore, to keep out of their hands and thwart their designs if possible, that perhaps they may not urge the necessity of force and blood against their own fellow citizens and loyal subjects, and become ashamed and withdraw their pursuits. But if they should not do this, and shall urge the necessity of force, and I, if by any means should be taken, these are therefore to command you forthwith, without delay, regardless of life or death, to rescue me out of their hands. And further, to treat any pretensions to the contrary, unlawful and unconstitutional, and as a mob got up for the purpose as religious persecution to take away the rights of men. And further, that our chartered rights and privileges shall be considered by us as holding the supremacy in the premises and shall be maintained, nothing short of the Supreme Court of this state having authority to disannul them, and the municipal court having jurisdiction in my case. You will see, therefore, that the peace of the city of Nauvoo is kept. Let who will endeavor to disturb it. Let, as in release, let go of. Send them sleeping with the fishes. If there are any threats in the city, let legal steps be taken on the part of those that make the threats, and let no man, woman, or child be intimidated, nor suffer it to be done. Nevertheless, as I said in the first place, we will take every measure that lays in our power and make every sacrifice that God or man could require at our hands to preserve the peace and safety of the people without collision. And if sacrificing my own liberty for months and years without stooping to the disgrace of Missouri persecution and violence, and Thomas Carlin's misrule and corruption, I bow to my fate with cheerfulness and all due deference in the consideration of the lives, safety, and welfare of others. But if this policy cannot accomplish the desired object, let our charter and our municipality, free trade, and sailors' rights be our motto, and go ahead, David Crockett-like, and lay down our lives like men and defend ourselves to the best advantage we can to the very last. You are, therefore, hereby authorized and commanded, by virtue of the authority which I hold in commission granted me by the executive of this state, to maintain the very letter and spirit of the above contents of this letter to the very best of your ability, to the extent of our lives and our fortunes, and to the lives and the fortunes of the Nauvoo Legion, as also all those who may volunteer their lives and their fortunes with ours for the defense of our wives, our children, our fathers, and our mothers, our homes, our graveyards, and our tombs, and our dead and their tombstones, and our dead bought American liberties with the blood of our fathers, and all that is dear and sacred to man. Shall we shrink at the onset? No. Let every man's brow be as the face of a lion. Let his heart be unshaken as the mighty oak, and his knee confirmed as the sapling of the forest. By the voice and loud roar of the cannon, and the loud peals and thundering of artillery, and by the voice of the thunderings of heaven as upon Mount Sinai, and by the voice of the heavenly hosts, and by the voice of the eternal God, and by the voice of innocent blood, and by the voice of innocence, and by the voice of all that is sacred and dear to man, let us plead the justice of our cause, trusting in the arm of Jehovah, the Elohim, who sits enthroned in the heavens, that peradventure he may give us the victory. And if we bleed, we shall bleed in a good cause, in the cause of innocence and truth. And from henceforth will there not be a crown of glory for us? And will not those who come after us hold our names in sacred remembrance? And will our enemies dare to brand us with cowardly reproach? With these considerations, I subscribe myself yours most faithfully and respectfully, with acknowledgments of your high and honored trust as Major General of the Nauvoo Legion. Signed, Joseph Smith. This letter had a lot of messages, apparent and hidden, to dissect. Most notably, it instructs Wilson Law to prepare the Nauvoo Legion for war, if the state militias come into Nauvoo ringing for the prophet. The Mormons weren't to be treated in Illinois the way they had suffered in Missouri. At least they'd willingly give their lives to not suffer it again. Now, there was a postscript that I cut out that told Wilson Law to not make public anything he or Joe communicate to each other during this time. So the Mormons, the average Mormon population, were completely unaware that they were even to be prepared for battle at a moment's notice here. But Joe and Wilson Law knew that could happen. That knowledge likely made its way to the highest-ranking Mormon elites, especially other major generals of the Nauvoo Legion and other ranking officers. And yes, pedants, that's the right pluralization. Get off my back. Wilson Law received the letter the evening of the 16th, and he replied the next day under Joe's directions, making sure that nobody was following the messengers to reveal Joe's location. It's a very brief letter. Dear friend, everything is moving along in the city in the usual tranquil and industrious manner. There is no charge in the appearance of things that a common observer could see, although to one who knows and is acquainted with the countenance of the thinking few, it is evident that their minds are troubled more than common, and I know by myself that they cannot help it. Why should it be otherwise when the Lord's anointed is hunted like a lion of forest by the most wicked and oppressive generation that has ever been since the days of the Savior of the world? Indeed, every movement of this generation reminds me of the history of the people who crucified Christ, It was nothing but mob law, mob rule, and mob violence all the time. The only difference is that the governors then were more just than the governors now. They were willing to acquit innocent men, but our governors now despise justice, garble and prevent law, and join in with the mob in pursuit of innocent blood. I've been meditating on your communication of yesterday, and will just add a thought or so on the subject, respecting particularly your going to Pine County. I think I would not go there for some time, if at all. I do not believe that an armed force will come upon us at all unless they get hold of you first, and that we rescue you, which we would do under any circumstances with the help of God, but I would rather do it within the limits of the city under the laws of the city. Therefore I would think it better to quarter in the city and not long in one place at once. I see no reason why you might not stay in safety within the city for months without any knowing it, only those who ought, and that as few as is necessary. I must close for the present, remaining as ever your affectionate friend and obedient servant. Signed, Wilson Law. Joe may have been separated from the public here, but he wasn't far away. Now, he didn't know what conversations were happening in his absence, nor was he privy to how anxious other Mormon elites, or as Law called them, the thinking few, saw the situation. But even in this time of anxiety and certainty, Joe and Emma's love endured. Sort of. So after she had visited and stayed the night, Joe woke up the morning of August 16th and took a minute to write to his dear wife. Once again, the reason that I'm reading these exchanges almost in their entirety is because they offer a window into the mind of Joe and Emma and other Mormon elites here, which otherwise is completely absent from the history. I mean, really, history is nothing if we don't take time to appreciate the human element when provided the opportunity. So Joe begins his letter by expressing his love and appreciation to Emma for her visits. After that, he goes on to some administrative issues communicated to him concerning the people who were trying to arrest him, related to him, through some important visitors the night previous. He goes on to direct Emma with relation to Governor Carlin and Quincy. Now, when she was visiting Joe, she must have asked for leave in order to plead his case to the governor, but Joe wasn't so certain that Carlin was a friend at this time. After that, in the letter, he talks about how much the current situation is really weighing down on his mind. I think that's very important. We're going to get to it here. Now, a fair amount of this letter is the logistics of how the Smith family would simply disappear west to the frontier if it all came down to it. It almost strikes fatalistic tones. Understandably, Joe was under a lot of stress at this time, as was Emma. Near the end of this letter, he really lets that side shine through a little bit. My dear Emma, I embrace this opportunity to express to you some of my feelings this morning. First of all, I take the liberty to tender you my sincere thanks for the 2 interesting and consoling visits that you have made me during my almost exiled situation. Tongue cannot express the gratitude of my heart for the warm and true-hearted friendship you have manifested in things toward me. The time has passed away since you left me, very agreeably, thus far my mind being perfectly reconciled to my fate, let it be what it may. I've been kept from melancholy and dumps by the kind-heartedness of Brother Derby and his interesting chit-chat from time to time, which has called my mind from the more strong contemplations of things and subjects that would have preyed more earnestly upon my feelings. Last night, in the night, Brother Hiram, George Miller, and William Law and others came to see us. They seemed much agitated and expressed some fears in consequence of some maneuverings and some flying reports which they had heard in relation to our safety. But after relating what it was, I was able to comprehend the whole matter to my entire satisfaction and did not feel at all alarmed or uneasy. They think, however, that the militia will be called out to search the city, and if this should be the case, I'd be much safer for the time being at a little distance off, until Governor Thomas Carlin could get weary and be made ashamed of his corrupt and unhallowed proceedings. I had supposed, however, that if there were any serious operations taken by the governor, that Judge Ralston or Brother Hollister would have notified us, and cannot believe that anything very serious is to be apprehended until we obtain information from a source that can be relied on. I've consulted whether it is best for you to go to Quincy and see the governor, but on the whole, he's a fool, and the impressions that are suggested to my mind are that it will be of no use, and the more we notice him and flatter him, the more eager he will be for our destruction. You may write to him whatever you see proper, but to go and see him, I don't give my consent at present. Brother Miller again suggested to me the propriety of my accompanying him to Pine Woods, and then he return and bring you and the children. My mind will eternally revolt at every suggestion of that kind, more especially since the dream and vision that was manifested to me last night. My safety is with you, if you want to have it so. Anything more or less than this cometh of evil. My feelings and counsel, I think, ought to be abided. If I go to the Pine County, you shall go along with me, and the children, and if you and the children go not with me, I don't go. I do not wish to exile myself for the sake of my own life. I'd rather fight it out. It is for your sakes, therefore, that I would do such a thing. I will go with you then in the same carriage and on horseback from time to time, as occasion may require, for I am not willing to trust you in the hands of those who cannot feel the same interest for you that I feel, to be subject to the caprice, temptations, or notions of anybody whatsoever. And I must say that I am prepossessed somewhat with the notion of going to the Pine County anyhow, for I am tired of the mean, low, and unhallowed vulgarity of some portions of the society in which we live, and I think if I could have a respite of about 6 months with my family, it would be a savor of life unto me, with my house. Nevertheless, if it were possible, I would like to live here in peace and wind up my business, but if it should be ascertained to a dead certainty that there is no other remedy, then we will round up our shoulders and cheerfully endure it. And this will be the plan. Let my horse, saddle, saddlebags, and valise to put some shirts and clothing in be sent to me. Let Brother Derby and Miller take a horse and put it into my buggy with a trunk containing my heavier clothes, shoes, and boots, etc., and let Brother John Taylor accompany us to his father's, and there we will tarry, taking every precaution to keep out of the hands of the enemy until you can arrive with the children. Let Brother Hiram bring you. Let Lauren Walker and Brother William Clayton come along, and bring all the writings and papers, books and histories, for we shall want a scribe in order that we may pour upon the world the truth like the lava of Mount Vesuvius. Then let all the goods, household furniture, cloth, store goods that can be procured, be put onto the boat, and let 20 or 30 of the best men that we can find be put on board to man it, and let them meet us at Prairie du Chien. And from thence we will wend our way like the larks up the Mississippi until the towering mountains and rocks shall remind us of the places of our nativity, and shall look like safety and home. And then we will bid defiance to the world, to Carlin, to Boggs, to Bennett, and all their whorish and motley clan that follow in their wake, Missouri not excepted, and until the damnation of hell rolls upon them by the voice and dread thunders and trump of the eternal God, in that day will we not shout in the victory and be crowned with eternal joys for the battles we have fought, having kept the faith and overcome the world? Tell the children that it is well with their father as yet, and that he remains in fervent prayer to Almighty God for the safety of himself and for you and for them. Tell Mother Smith that it shall be well with her son, whether in life or in death, for thus saith the Lord God. Tell her that I remember her all the while, as well as Lucy Milliken and all the rest. They must be of good cheer. Tell Hiram to be sure and not fail to carry out my instructions, but at the same time, if Matilda does not come, and we should get any favorable information, all may be well yet. Yours in haste, your affectionate husband until death, through all eternity forevermore. Signed, Joseph Smith. Emma's reply is revealing. I've cut little pieces about finances out that they're not relevant for today. So here's the bulk of it. Dear husband, I am ready to go with you if you are obliged to leave, and Hiram says he will go with me. I shall make the best arrangements I can and be as well prepared as possible. But still, I feel good confidence that you can be protected without leaving this country. There are more ways than one to take care of you, and I believe that you can still direct in your business concerns if we are all of us prudent in the matter. If it was a pleasant weather, I should contrive to see you this evening, but I dare not run too much of a risk on account of so many going to see you. Brother Derby will tell you all the information we have on hand. I think we will have news from Quincy as soon as tomorrow. Yours affectionately forever, Emma Smith. Emma's ready to go. Come outer darkness or the destroyer upon the waters. Emma was sealed to Joe and ready to fulfill his wishes. She was smart enough to not be tailed when visiting Joe in hiding and realized that too many people were visiting him and that if she went, headed out of town, that would arouse too much suspicion. This letter exchange exhibits just how much of an emotional pillar that she was to Joe in times of need. They leaned on each other in the most dire of times. The point of it all is that they are human beings. Everybody we read about here, they're all human beings. They all dealt with the same stresses, the same happinesses, and the same emotions that we have today. Power and authority. They dealt with that too. I guess that's kind of the point of all of this, is Joe's power during this Bennett meltdown, it rested on a knife's edge. He had a group of trusted individuals who had swore undying fealty to him. Then there were the thousands of other average Mormons who weren't privy to the information that the higher ranks were. He had power. Joe was king of the kingdom on the Mississippi. With all that considered, though, what really comprised Joe's power and authority? A few thousand people believed that he was the mouthpiece of God, but nobody granted him that status. He just said it enough times that eventually people said, okay, yeah, this guy talks to God. Why would he lie about something like that? I mean, if you think about it, somebody in an elected position or an academic authority in a specific field, they've usually put their lives' work into gaining that authority. Millions of people across the planet say that X or Y person is the president or prime minister of our country because they deserve it. X or Y have done what it takes to gain the authority of that position, and they reap the power that such authority usually includes. Even then, though, it's up to those millions of people every single day to agree that person X or Y is deserving of the authority that they are granted. Without millions of people in support of them, what power do these officials truly wield? What authority do they have when the rest of the world leaders openly laugh at them and don't recognize their claims to power? Does their power and authority continue once they no longer hold whatever position granted such status? Thing is, Joe's power was so vulnerable in 1842. He was just a guy. He was a guy who told thousands of people that he deserved authority because he had power within him that an unseen force had granted. But that wasn't exactly testable. It was only the people who believed him that created the fountainhead of his power. But the dude could have been killed just like any other person. Then what would happen to all of that claimed power and authority? I mean, the fountainhead of believers were still there creating the position of power and authority. It just required somebody to step up to the plate and claim that they deserved the job. And really, isn't that the source of all divides in human cultures? Coup d'etats, groups of people at war, religious schisms. All of these boil down to a body of benefactors in the form of believers contributing their fealty to a position or to a single idea or a concept. Then all it takes is a person coming along and saying, I deserve that fealty. There are two sides to this power dynamic. Those who give power and authority and those who take it. Needless to say, Mormonism has never been one to just leave power and authority lying around. All right, that's going to do it for the meat of the show, but don't go anywhere yet. Have a little bit of house cleaning to do here. So we don't have any new patrons to thank, but I do want to go through and thank some of our top donors who have been signed up for a long time or signed up at a high level and have, really formed the backbone of support for this show. So thank you so much to Preston, to Judy, Chris and Christy, to Jay, Frank, Kevin, Philip, Mindy, Karen, Shelley, Josh, Curtis, Andrea, Shane, Nathan, George, Andrew, Eric, Dan, Lane, Cam, Derek, Stewart, Jared, Howard, David, James, Doug, Randy, Lynn, Timothy, Cass, Doubting Dogma, Joe, Doonan. An anagram for Spyro Agnew is grow a penis. Oh, that's fantastic. Mark, Dean, Jeff, David, Heather and Brandon King, my good friends, Misty, Aaron, Dawn, Lee, Darren, Marie, new name Joanna. You shouldn't tell people that your name, James, Bevan, and Michelle. So to all of the people who have supported the show for a long time or at a high level, thank you so much. You are all so fantastic, and I sincerely appreciate the support that allows me to do this full time. I hope all of you enjoy all of the extra content that you get by signing up at patreon.com, which this week, it was actually our monthly Nemo Home Evening. We didn't do it for October because I was nowhere to be found. Instead, we did it for November, and I put together a panel on straight epistemology. It was super fun, and patrons of the show, you can go and check it out, or anybody, actually. We live streamed it onto YouTube. You can find it on the Naked Mormonism YouTube channel. It is the Nemo Home Evening for November of 2018, and I did my best to try and defend Joseph Smithicism against the onslaughts of straight epistemology and the Socratic method. It was quite fun, needless to say. If you've never heard of Joseph Smithicism, maybe that'll be a fun little introduction for you. We started out kind of late in the show. It ended up going longer than we all expected, but Colleen, Brian, and Dan were fantastic hosts. I really appreciate them coming on and had a really good time. Also, if you happen to be in the Pacific Northwest area, did you know there's a Sunstone coming up? Sunstone Seattle next weekend, November 17th. I'm going to be there. If you're in the area or you can make it up here, or if you want to go to a single day Sunstone session, that's going to be at the Sunstone, the Seattle Community of Christ congregation here. Now, these satellite Sunstones are usually a little bit smaller, significantly smaller than the Salt Lake City, nowhere near the attendees, but they're still really fun, and it really creates an intimate area where you're presenting in a small room with a lot of people who are there and engaging at face-to-face, distance, and it just creates a very intimate atmosphere. It's awesome. So if you're in Seattle, if you're nearby, it'd be awesome to see you there. That is November 17th, 2018. You can find tickets on it at sunstonemagazine.com, and they have it Sunstone-Northwest-18. That's where you can get tickets for it. So with all of that said, one more quick announcement. Objectively, Dan, or one of our panelists, Dan, of the Nemo Home Meeting, he does a weekly show on straight epistemology, and I am going to be guest hosting with him. So that is going to be at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time on Friday, November 9th, 2018. Yeah, there's a lot coming up here in, early and mid-November, and it is a live call-in show. If you have somebody who you think would be a good fit, preferably somebody who is Mormon and can't wait to evangelize to friends or family members, or anybody just walking down the street, a missionary, might be a good opportunity to have them call in, and they'll be pitted against myself and Objectively Dan, and we are just wielding this simple tool of the Socratic method and created around the idea of street epistemology in order to just ask them questions about why they believe what they believe. So if you have that friend, coworker that's a Mormon who might do well or might enjoy calling into a show, with a couple of godless heathens, it'd be really cool to see them on there. We're trying to spread the word and get some Mormons to call in. All right, I suppose that is everything for today. Of course, as always, thank you so much for joining me. And I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as production assistant and director of social media, and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is produced by Jason Camo from aloststateofmind.com and is used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnome Studios, LLC, copyright 2018, all rights reserved.